Meanwhile, Trump signed a slew of executive orders this week aimed at higher education and K through 12 schools. It comes as the president nears the end of his first 100 days in office this time around. Joining us for discussion is the host of the Educate U.S. podcast, Nick Zaveri. Good to have you with us today. Now, the orders are aimed at a couple of issues, from reducing DEI initiatives to aligning curricula with conservative policy goals. One of the orders getting a lot of attention directs reforms to accreditation standards to prioritize student outcomes, intellectual diversity among faculty, and competition among accreditors. But some critics worry it's government overreach.
Yeah, it's the irony here is that the Trump administration, in an effort to essentially render the Department of Education toothless, has basically tried to become the new Department of Education. Essentially, the White House is now saying, well, the DOE, can't be trusted, so we can be, despite the fact that you have a Secretary of Education who has no education background pretty much at all, and a president who has never been named a president of a college, a school superintendent, and has no educational background. So we're trading the DOE, and I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying this is what it is. You're trading the Department of Education for essentially the White House making determinations on everything from educational standards to potentially DEI policies in schools. So I'm wondering why I'm at a loss why the White House has decided that they are the actual arbiters of American education, but we shouldn't trust the Department of Education.
Interesting. And the White House would say that they, I think, are trying to give that power back to the states. How do you see them approaching this? Is there another way that's more effective, you think?
Yeah. I mean, that's the offering from the White House, that we're trying to give it back to the states. You could give it back. You could easily have just moved forward, dismantled the Department of Education, which they're essentially doing, and just say, we're getting out of the education business. Period. End of sentence. But they haven't. Instead, they want to put forward guidelines that talk about, for example, intellectual diversity in colleges. Well, what makes us think that there isn't any? Why do we assume that every single professor, every single student, every single class all has an intellectual leaning that's to the left? That's the assumption that conservatives like to make, and that's not necessarily true. I mean, I'm a college graduate myself. I'm currently in grad school now. I don't certainly know the political ideologies of every professor I've ever had, nor every student I've ever gone to school with. So it's hard for me to accept that there's an assumption there about the intellectual standpoint or political viewpoints of students. Yes, some colleges tend to be pretty blanketly obvious about what political leanings they have, but that doesn't mean the students all necessarily follow along.
I want to look at one of the other orders that was signed this week, mandating the immediate disclosure of foreign funding exceeding $250,000 for higher education institutions with stricter enforcement. Just considering the role of China-backed Confucius Institutes and other foreign influence campaigns on campus, how effective do you think this move could be in addressing that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some merit to, not even so much merit about, but more about, okay, so let's disclose that. I guess the assumption here is, by understanding how much foreign influence there is, then that may potentially mean that a particular college may have an intellectual lean. Again, this always comes back to, at least for the Trump administration, about, what are the political leanings of an institution? How do we use the power of the purse at the federal level to change their intellectual perspective? And again, the irony here is that clearly the Trump administration has their own perspective, like anyone does. The assumption here is that, well, because we have the federal purse strings, we can make you think the way we want you to think. And that in and of itself is akin to other countries that we've seen, where we're very alarmed by the fact that there's a push at the federal level to push forward an ideology. That being said, it is a little weird the White House is worried about the foreign disclosures about universities, but it's the same Trump administration, specifically the Justice Department, that wasn't so worried about the foreign disclosures about what happened with New York City Mayor Adams. I mean, it's a bit of a stretch of an analogy, but in that case, we're seeing examples of foreign money fueled into New York City, but the mayor was essentially placed off the hook from the Justice Department. But in this case about universities, the Trump administration is very curious about foreign dollars coming in. Makes total sense, I guess, but they're inconsistent about what foreign entities are they worried about in terms of following the dollars. I'm asking for a little bit of consistency here. But again, make no mistake about it. If at the end of the day, the federal government is saying, we have the right to make these demands of you because you're asking us for money in isolation, it's a fair assessment. It's really up to colleges to decide, are they going to play ball? We've seen obviously Harvard most recently basically build up their campaign or their war chest to combat the administration. Other colleges may not necessarily follow suit, but as a separate idea, the federal government could certainly ask about foreign dollars coming in.
And just on a side note, the long arm of the Chinese Communist Party and their moves to infiltrate U.S. society is a bipartisan issue on many fronts, even just seen in the secret police stations that have been discovered across the country as well.
It's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
I mean, at the same time, though, we've seen foreign dollars, particularly Chinese dollars, in New York City real estate, but we're not worried about that. So you can ask yourself, why is it that we're worried about the infusion of foreign dollars in certain places as opposed to others? Because yes, maybe it's real estate, but do we still run the risk of potentially indoctrination of an ideology that we're not comfortable with, even if it's showing up in the form of real estate payments? Well,
real estate, another issue. There have been various governors and laws floated in various states trying to address this order of foreign ownership, particularly near U.S. bases. So just staying back on the issue of education and the executive orders that were signed this week, we're looking now at jobs, and there was an order saying federal workforce investments will be consolidated and streamlined to propel Americans into high-paying trade jobs. Now, that move is in part a way to reduce reliance on four-year degrees. How influential do you think the administration can be on students, and can it steer them to reevaluate their career choices, perhaps, in this move?
It's a fascinating conversation because, and again, I can't stress this enough. The Trump administration has said that they want families to decide for themselves what is the best proper educational course. We've heard this from organizations like Moms for Liberty throughout the Trump administration, but the administration continues to put forward the fact that they feel they are best equipped to make these decisions, or at least use the leverage of federal dollars to help sway these decisions. Again, I think it makes perfect sense for people to recognize whether a four-year liberal arts degree makes sense. I mean, I've talked to plenty of people in different trade fields where they'll say that they're not seeing the next generation of employees come in, and that makes them alarmed. Everyone from HVAC repair folks to cable employees. There's a real concern about labor in terms of blue-collar jobs and who's going to fulfill them in this country. So it makes sense for not even so much the administration, but for people in general to say, should I actually pursue a four-year degree? Not for nothing, for myself, yeah, I probably would have benefited by being a plumber or an electrician in addition to the work I currently do in higher education. But that's for folks to decide. Again, if the administration is going to try to encourage trade schools or encourage folks to look at trades, I think there's some value there, but at the same time, I'm not necessarily comfortable about that mandate or that push coming down from the federal level, because similar to the administration at one point, I don't think federal intrusion in that way makes a ton of sense, but that's kind of what we're seeing right now. But yes, I think to have people reevaluate career paths, be more knowledgeable about trades that may necessarily require a different educational pathway makes a ton of sense.
Listen, if we even think you owe us money, you won't know what hit you. We'll put liens on everything you own. Raid your bank accounts, retirement fund, pension. You'll open up your paycheck and cry because we'll already have the money.
Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a Tax Doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.